Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us for this webinar as part of Cyber Scotland Week. We're going to be looking at how to embed the right approach to security with your digital ambitions.
Good morning all. So the future landscape is an interesting challenge because the whole concept of how we're looking to deliver applications and IT services is evolving quite rapidly. The days when we would have a couple of data centers and traditional office locations with users in those office locations is changing significantly. So if you talk to any organization, software as a service hosted remotely and delivered to wherever those users are is a fact. And that's coming for everyone. Cloud is a fact, public cloud, and many organizations for different reasons could be considering a couple of different cloud options. There's still going to be a place in all of that for traditional applications being hosted in data centers. And then, of course, you have the users. So users are going to be in many different locations. Before the pandemic, we had a drive towards mobility, agility, people getting close to where they needed to be from a client or service point of view. So the traditional model was changing quite a bit then. When you reflect upon that journey and consider things like networking and security and how you deliver services, you realize that a lot of the traditional models are broken or stressed by that change. And so with any plan that you have as an organization, you need to be able to look at that plan, think about the changes, the new technologies, the way in which you're going to change your service and say, what is the impact in terms of our security model? What do we need to rethink? Is this technology fit for purpose? Do we need to change our approach? And so across everything we plan to do, we need to have that consideration.
So we've got lots of people on the call today who'll be from different types of organizations, Nick. Does that break in the traditional security model apply to everybody, or are there different scenarios for different types of business, do you think?
Well, there are some common themes across them. So if you look at public sector, for example, the drive to share locations, share data, and be responsive to some of the challenges through the pandemic has really driven a different style of working across those bodies. But of course, when you start to share that information, it breaks some of the existing security models, or can break those models. So I'm absolutely certain that way of working is going to continue, particularly as, unfortunately, stress starts to come in around budgets and ways of working. So public sector, it absolutely is top of the agenda for me to think about how we can layer security models across different styles of working. If you look at commercial firms, there's just as much pressure on them to look at how they can deliver and operate differently. It's quite intriguing the amount of pressure in certain organizations around future working from home. But of course, that brings a different security challenge and a different IT support challenge. You know, most IT teams are absolutely flat out at the moment. They're dealing with more calls, and those calls are taking longer to respond. So actually, those IT teams have less time to be able to bake in security or think about security in a lot of the work that they're doing. So actually, I think the pressures is just as great across every different sector for different reasons, but the pressure is just as great.
And what are the threats that we're facing? What does your average cyber criminal look like, act like? What are they up to?
Well, I think the interesting thing about a lot of these organizations that we are attempting to address is they're either privately funded and are strategic and employ the best that they can and give them the right sort of technology tools. They're highly motivated. You know, we've all seen instances where they take very much a long game in terms of, you know, trying to infect an organization and then not take action until the appropriate point in time. Or, of course, there are state-funded organizations who operate for different reasons. We've also seen, intriguingly, organizations who have been hacked because of some commercial challenges that they've faced. And so, you know, the hack or the attack isn't just about ransomware. It can be all about stopping an organization's ability to operate and function. We know about the high profile social activity that has gone on in places like Facebook and attempting to influence elections. But actually, commercial organizations and public sector bodies can face that kind of disinformation campaign and can also face situations where external groups want to stop them or inhibit their ability to function.
And of course, then there's that huge reputational damage as well that comes into play, doesn't it? And the fact if, you're fined by the ICO or whatever, that can wreck a business as well as the actual operational capabilities.
It's really interesting that over all the years that I've been consulting, which are many, you often see situations where organizations can be very robust in terms of their protection of data, their backup, and their security. And if you drill down, you typically see that they've been faced with some sort of challenge in their past. Others who've not faced that challenge tend to be still very professional and structured in their approach, but there is no doubt facing the risk of some sort of business disruption or challenges in terms of your profile as an organization, or a greater focus from the ICO or any of the governing bodies does create a different kind of culture. And in a way, that's wrong. You should always be operating as though you are being scrutinized. You should always be operating as though you're under threat. The most important thing with all of this isn't about the technology tools. It's about the mindset you bring.
A lot of businesses don't have the luxury of having a chief information security officer or a large IT team that has specific security skills. How do those businesses cope with these threats?
Well, it's an interesting challenge, that. I did sit down the other day and look at a complex infrastructure of an organization we're working with and think about all the different threats in there and the areas of vulnerability, etc. And I thought to myself after that, it's a 7-day-a-week job to be able to be on top of all of that. And actually, it reinforces the reality, which is it's not the responsibility of one person. There cannot be one person who's responsible for IT security. You need a senior exec or a senior stakeholder who absolutely understands the threat and buys into the responsibility of communicating to all that there is a threat, and everyone in the organization needs to play a part in countering that or be responsible for their behavior, whether it's an individual working on a potentially insecure Wi-Fi connection, or whether it's a development team, or whether it's the infrastructure team, or whether it's the way that someone might be sharing data or confidential information over WhatsApp, or whatever it might be. That top-down approach and education of everyone is an organizational responsibility. Cannot be one person. If it's one person and the organization thinks we've got it sorted because it's so-and-so in the corner, then they run a greater risk than anyone else.
So how do you kind of buy into that as an organization? How do you change IT make IT cybercrime or cyber threats the responsibility of people other than your IT team? How do you kind of communicate all that?
Well, I think it is about education, and it's about ongoing education. And the government have done some very good things around Cyber Essentials, Cyber Essentials Plus. But actually, it's an ongoing process. There is no point in just sending an email around, or doing a single communication, or talking to people who might be in a group where there might be a risk of data loss. You need to have an ongoing program. And that is why I think that the education communication needs to be at the core of any risk management framework. So if you think about, as part of your assessment of the level of risk you face as an organization, all the different component parts, and then come up with a plan which has education, communication, and of course the right technology tools at part of that framework, and you have to manage it and review it and own it with your senior stakeholder going forward. So it's constant, it's ongoing, because the threats don't stay still, and your IT doesn't stay still, and your organization doesn't stay still. It's always evolving. And I, thinking about this call today, did a bit of searching around on the internet in terms of some of the common threats people are facing during 2021. There's some new and quite worrying stuff in terms of how people are trying to get access to organizations. The days of the brute force attack on a firewall, they're still here, it's still going on, but actually people are using social engineering much more to try and entice information out, to try and learn passwords, to really try and gain some sort of edge. And of course, that risk management framework can't just be about your own organization. You need to think about the partners you work with. Who's part of your supply chain? What's the back door into your organization? What's the risk profile? Who's allowed access to what? How often do you check that? How do you protect yourself against your supply chain is as big a part of this as educating your users.
And as you say there, Nick, it all comes down to human behavior, doesn't it? I mean, the biggest threats are, somebody clicking on a link in an email or not reading an email and understanding that there are slight changes in the vocabulary being used. It's so subtle sometimes, and they can also get into your network and sit there and wait for months on end, just waiting for the right moment.
Yeah, they're waiting for a transaction or waiting for an opportunity to be able to exploit that. As I said, these people are strategic in terms of the approach they take, and which is why you need to operate the same way and think longer term about how you protect yourselves during your operation. I think also the responsibility of the organization is a really important one. And the stakeholder has to buy in. He has to help, or she has to help with the education process. Marketing has to play a part in it. And I think that one of the things that internally within IMART we're really good at is communicating some of the breaches and issues that others are facing to keep that profile high all the time. Using examples of how organizations in typical industries have suffered from this. I often hear people talking about cyber insurance, and, it's after the fact, isn't it? It's like saying, well, it's all right, I've got an insurance policy, but my house is burnt down and I've lost everything. There's a degree of comfort there, but the damage, the reputational damage, the operational damage is huge. So that ownership has to be throughout the organization. And in some situations, I've seen it built into organizations or teams or individuals' KPIs as well. It's one of the intriguing things if you think about application developers, all wonderful people. How are they judged? Are they judged on how efficient their code is? Absolutely. But sometimes you get situations where code is written really efficiently, but actually no one has baked security into that process, and that applications can have vulnerabilities that people, maybe commercial people, or maybe people looking to gain some sort of advantage, ransomware, could exploit. So the framework has to cover everything.
Yeah, developers love to develop applications that work fast, but don't necessarily have security on them. Just a quick note for everybody, if you've got any questions, please drop them into the Q&A box, and we'll pick them up with Nick at the end. So please do that. We'd be delighted to answer any questions that you've got. So we've talked about the kind of human behavior, the organization. You've talked about the supply chain risk as well. It's really important to do due diligence on your suppliers. This is all about kind of resilience, isn't it? And risk management for the long term, Nick, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why I think it's so important it's organization wide, and actually thinking about the way your organization works, how it interfaces with suppliers, how it engages with its customers or citizens. All of those different things are really important, because you don't need many gaps for there to be a problem. I remember about 2 years ago, there was a very high profile organization, and this organization used to present at events. I remember they presented at an Amazon Web Services event about how forward thinking they were and all the wonderful stuff they're doing, and it all was great. They suffered a serious breach, and it was through the simple fact of leaving a couple of RDP servers open to the outside world. So all of the noise they made around doing great stuff around technology all disappeared in an instant, because a hard-pressed IT team either didn't have the resources or didn't have the time really to be able to contain some of those risks. And I think it is about making sure that people have the time and resource available to deal with these issues. So it's a real challenge.
What about technologies? How can we help these hard-pressed teams then? So there are different technologies that you can use, different tools that you can use to sort of build a service, and we at IMART have our own managed service, which we can kind of manage a lot of that stuff for organizations as well. But what should they be looking at? What sort of technologies should they be considering?
Well, it's interesting how networking and security is becoming entwined, and I think that's absolutely the right thing. And there are some very interesting vendors who are really advancing quite well there. But the intriguing thing is that all these technologies, as they always have been, are only as good as the set of requirements and design process and implementation process. So, you know, it's like though everyone who's taken Office 365, one of the shocking things for me is people who've taken it have gone with some of the default settings in terms of security, you know, and actually you need to think about the design, you need to think about the implementation, you need to think about the risk and make those design decisions. When you've done all of that, technology is only as good as responding to the threat. And, you know, all this analytics that is available, all the reporting which is available needs tuning and needs focus, but most of all, it needs someone to be able to respond to a situation. And if you think across all of the IT industry at the moment, all teams are hard pressed, as I've said, and quite often people don't get enough resource to deliver what they need. And I actually think that more organizations than perhaps in the past are going to start to think about out-tasking or outsourcing some of these services, really because I'm not sure they're going to have a choice. They're going to need to make some decisions around what they focus their resource on. So there are some great technologies. A lot of them are you know, very applicable to the modern world, the hybrid world we're talking about. But also they can deliver quite a useful and valuable service to users. In the old days, where devices were very locked down, users would suffer in terms of their experience and their ability to work. Now, some of these technologies are really, really dynamic in terms of your ability to be able to allow certain tasks and not allow others. And we've done some interesting work recently with a product called Zscaler, which is a SaaS-based service, but actually has a whole load of ability to be able to configure and deliver a user experience whilst constraining or reducing risk in terms of what that user looks like and how they behave and how they act. So the technology is great, but you need to be able to design and then manage it.
And also there, you touched on something there, Nick, you've got to balance the need for security with the experience that your users are having. You don't want to end up with people not being able to access data, because fundamentally every business needs data. They want to use data better. If people still can't have a good experience while trying to access all these corporate applications and information, then, you know, you can be as secure as possible, but nobody in your organization is going to buy into what you're doing because it's restricting the way that they work and operate.
Risk assessment is a really interesting thing. And should the risk assessment around a particular activity or way of working be purely down to the IT team, or is it an organizational decision? I think it's the latter. And I think that if you're looking at delivering a new style of working or a new set of applications, or bringing on board a new partner, or thinking about using your data in a different way or sharing your data, there needs to be a risk assessment process. The business or the organization needs to be at the core of that risk assessment process. IT offers the input, IT offers some guidance, IT offers some tools and approaches in terms of that risk assessment process, but ultimately it's a business decision. And that's why you need this ability to carry out this assessment and make these decisions effectively. And then you can work in a joined up manner.
Yeah. So let's go back to that main title then, and aligning your cybersecurity with your digital ambitions, Nick. What sort of top tips would you pass on to the people that have joined us today?
Well, we did a piece of strategy work for an organization the other day. It laid out a whole path of change over a number of years, different technology choices, different styles of working, different applications, a whole number of different things. And they came back to me afterwards and they're saying, what do you see as the biggest risk in terms of undertaking this strategy? And there's no doubt at all in my mind, for many organizations, it's the human factor, it's people, it's having enough in terms of skills, it's education, it's communication and ongoing management. And you can have all the technology in the world, but if you haven't got the human factor right, then you have a real challenge. I think reviewing some of the technologies you have is really important because like at any time in the IT industry, some vendors have a roadmap for the future and others are not as focused on some of those future situations. And it may also be a time when actually, traditional vendors, traditional ways of doing things may no longer be right. And I think one of the intriguing pieces for organizations going forward is making those decisions around the security and network infrastructure that supports their business, because it may well not be fit for purpose in the modern world. But of course, that's quite a big chunk of change. Some of that may be outsourced. A lot of technologies are known and loved in there. So you need to make those decisions, and you need to engage the organization and say, actually, longer term, we need to make some decisions here around this underlying infrastructure. It's not just about protecting the organization, it's about enabling a whole new style of working. So in many ways, we're at the beginning of a curve in terms of lots of different investment in technology, lots of change. Security's got to absolutely be at the core of that in all the decisions we make, and actually around the technologies as well. The intriguing one for me at the moment is software as a service. And most software as a service providers will offer a form of DR. They'll back up the data to another location, they'll manage it for you, it'll be in their contract. But actually, far-sighted organizations are also putting in place a service to back that data up out of that provider's environment and to keep it safe either on-prem or in a cloud somewhere. The extra focus on protecting data is really important. And just because you've got that software as a service provider, or it's sitting in a cloud, or whatever it is, doesn't mean that you're secure. You're only really secure when you have some degree of control and ownership of what's going on. So we're seeing organizations doing that. We're seeing organizations who are embarking on a public cloud journey for the first time, look with much more rigor at disaster recovery and security and penetration testing, and really thinking about how they can make best use of the security and technology tools in the cloud to make them safe, but also looking back across all of this extended infrastructure and making some good decisions long term in terms of how they protect themselves.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Nick. If anybody has got a question, do pop it into the chat for us, or the Q&A feature at the moment. I think you summed it up really, really well there, Nick. But I guess just going back to the sort of hard-pressed small IT team, and I know when we've talked about using different technologies, sometimes, an IT team will get something might have happened overnight. Criminals aren't 9 to 5. They operate round the clock, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Some of those technologies mean that you've got to react to that email and try and fix the problem yourself. So it can be quite complicated, can't it, for a small team? But just going back to that outsourcing thing, do you think that's going to become more prevalent in terms of getting help with security?
Well, I think there are some interesting decisions to make. And I think the traditional shape of an IT team, whether it's 8 people or 80 people, needs to evolve. I think that the new technologies, the ways of delivering service, the way in which users want to consume technology, the way the threats are evolving, means that we need to think about a new shape to an IT team. And I actually don't think that siloed roles are as fit for purpose now as they used to be. So one security expert or one networking expert, or that's the person that does servers and backup. And I do think that in leading an IT team, you need to be able to think about how those roles are going to evolve and blend to a degree. That's one point. And security is at the core of that, the things I've talked about in terms of having a framework and making sure that everyone owns responsibility. The second bit around the outtasking or outsourcing is an interesting challenge there. And 24/7 operations needs a different style of approach. I don't think it can be one person on call anymore, or a couple of people on call. I think that you need to think seriously about how that's delivered. I have no doubt in my mind that there are opportunities in other time zones or geographies to be able to deliver a fairly deep service across maintaining the resilience and security of an organization. It doesn't need to cost a fortune. The key is in the structuring of it or setting that service up. We just need to think differently about that. After all, just assuming that the cyber criminal is going to stop at 6 at night or at 7 at night or at 8 at night is wrong. These people are going to work 24/7 to get access to your information, to get access to your data, and to exploit that breach. So I think the time is coming where organizations need to think, do that risk assessment, of course, but think about how do I provide proper 24/7 cover, and is security at the heart of that? And for a lot of organizations, medium, large organizations, it's got to be. It's got to be. There has to be the ability to be able to respond. And that response has to be tested on a regular basis. We talk about pen testing and the technology we put in place. The organizational response need to be tested. Can they respond in the way that the SLA spells out? What does that response look like? We all need these drills to be able to make sure the organization be protected. And, the interesting thing about some of these services is they require, there's a certain amount of intervention that can be done, and then they generally escalate to someone within the client organization, look for advice or guidance in terms of what happens. Does that process work? Does that person know what they need to be able to do? What does the communication to the users look like? How do we maintain business operations? Who are the people who communicate to our clients or our customers or whoever, our partner organizations, what we're doing? So that whole response plan needs to be thought through. Again, partly the responsibility of the IT team, but also has to be the business. The business is fundamental to this. Whether you're a public sector body or a commercial organization, there has to be ownership at the center.
Nick, thanks ever so much. I think you've summed it up brilliantly there. So thank you for your contribution today. I hope everybody who's joined us has got some really interesting, useful information out of that. You can find out more about what IAMART does on the security side of things by looking at our website, www.iamart.com. We'll be sending out a recording of this webinar for you as well. So obviously anybody who wants to look back and have another listen, please do. And do respond to the email that you get. If you have any other questions, we can answer those for you, or if you want to have a chat with an IAMART consultant in any shape or form. But thanks everybody for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks ever so much. Bye.